So we're up to section 5.8 of the course, and what we're doing here is developing an open economy model that we're going to use throughout the rest of this topic and in quite a few of the applications that we'll be doing this week and probably in later weeks as well. So what you can see, what we've basically got here is a demand and supply diagram, but it's a demand and supply diagram for the Australian dollar in foreign exchange markets. So what we've got up here on the vertical axis is the exchange rate. And the exchange rate is the price of one Australian dollar in a foreign currency. So if you want to buy a foreign currency, if you want to buy an Australian dollar or supply it, then the exchange rate is either the price you pay to buy that Australian dollar, or if you're supplying it, it's what you receive in exchange for supplying that Australian dollar in terms of foreign currency. But the exchange rate's a price. It's the price of one currency expressed in terms of another. So we've got this downward sloping, okay, so on the vertical, let me just summarize. On the vertical, we've got the price of the Australian dollar expressed in a foreign currency. And on the horizontal, we've got the quantity of these variables, NX and S minus I. So we've got these variables measured in billions of dollars. Okay, so the zero is going to be there, and these variables can become negative. So if we imagine that zero is approximately there, halfway between the origin and 60 billion, then we can sort of allow negative values of both S minus I and NX. Okay, so basically this horizontal axis to the right extends to positive infinity, to the left extends to negative infinity. Now we've got this, we know this is a demand and supply diagram, and we've got this downward sloping line, NX. That must be a demand curve. Can't be a supply curve. Supply curves never slope downwards. Must be a demand curve. So in what sense is it a demand curve? Well, first of all, it's a net demand curve, but we'll get to that. NX. NX is X minus M. Now think about that, X minus M. X is exports, and to buy Australian exports, foreigners need to demand the Australian dollar. So NX is X minus M. The X part creates a demand for the Australian dollar by foreigners. M, the second part of X minus M, creates a supply of the Australian dollar. So what we've actually got in this NX curve is a net demand curve. NX is X minus M. X creates a demand for the Australian dollar. M creates a supply of the Australian dollar. So it's a net demand curve. It's sort of the demand for Australian dollars by people buying Australian exports minus the supply of the Australian dollar by people buying foreign imports. The vertical line, therefore, must be a supply curve. So in what sense is it a supply curve? Well, if S minus I is positive 60 billion, because that's the position of this line on the horizontal axis, that 60 billion is literally saying, if you get the value of the variable S and the value of the variable I and subtract I from S, you're going to have $60 billion. In other words, we have excess savings over and above total domestic borrowing requirement of $60 billion. Excess savings of $60 billion. Now we already know what happens to those $60 billion. They flow overseas. But before those 60 billion Australian dollars can be spent overseas, they need to be switched into foreign currency. And at that point, when you take the $60 billion out of Australia and move it offshore so that it can be loaned to foreigners, at that point, you are supplying Australian dollars. So that's the sense in which you've got a demand curve and a supply curve in this diagram for the Australian dollar. So, of course, these two curves determine the price of the Australian dollar, which is the exchange rate, and I've just set it at ER1. because the Australian dollar is a floating exchange rate and it can move up and down freely, then this exchange rate is going to react to the forces of demand and supply. It's not going to be up here above ER1 because then we'd have excess supply of the Australian dollar. It's not going to be down here below ER1 because then we'd have excess demand for the Australian dollar. The exchange rate settles at ER1. At that point, equilibrium's at A, and at that point, just like I've got over here, we have a positive value of NX, which means that the current account balance is in surplus to the tune of $60 billion. So what I'm doing now is I'm using NX and the current account balance. I'm using those terms interchangeably, which is not entirely correct, but it's okay to do that for our purposes. Because the NX is the most important part of the current account balance, I'm just using NX and the current account balance interchangeably. So in this theoretical setup, what I'm actually doing by calling NX the current account balance, I'm assuming the primary income balance and the secondary income balance are both zero. Now, in the case of Australia, that's not true, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of this theoretical model that we're developing. In theoretical models like this, sometimes we have to make simplifications to make them workable, and that's just one we're doing here. So in calling NX, the value of NX, which is 60 billion in this model, and calling the current account balance 60 billion, I'm just, for convenience, assuming that the primary income balance is zero and the secondary income balance is zero as well. Why am I doing that? Simplicity, that's all. Just so that we can ignore the complexities of the primary income balance for now. Okay, so then we know that at point A, we've got a current account surplus of $60 billion. At the same time, S minus I is 60 billion. So that means we're sending $60 billion worth of $60 billion worth of domestic savings overseas. That money will be invested primarily in bond and stock markets. That's a form of foreign investment. So what we've got in this diagram at point A for Australia is net outward foreign investment. And all of all the foreign investment flows are recorded in the capital financial account. And because it's an outflow of money, it's actually recorded as a negative number. And so in this model, we would have a financial account or capital financial account deficit of 60 billion. Why is it a deficit? Because the money, the 60 billion, is flowing out of Australia. So that's the basic setup of the model. At this point, at point A, S minus I equals NX. At the same time, NCO equals NX. Same thing, because we know S minus I equals net capital outflow. And so we would have 60 billion equals 60 billion, or in the line below, 60 billion equals 60 billion. Now, of course, in Australia's case, the numbers are actually different, because we have a capital financial account surplus in Australia and we have a current account deficit in Australia. So if we were drawing this for Australia, we would have a minus figure next to the 60 billion. And a minus figure next to the 60 billion down here in this theoretical model would be consistent with a negative value here, a negative value of NX, and a positive value here, a capital financial account surplus. That's if we have a negative number. But because we've got a positive number here, we're talking about countries such as Japan, in this example, Germany, Taiwan, Korea, countries that have positive S minus I imbalances and positive levels of net exports. Okay, second last slide. How do you then use this model? Well, we'll start off at the same point here, point A, and we're assuming that Australia enters a recession. How will this affect the model? Okay, let's start off with, we've got four variables. in this model that could be impacted by the recession. The first is savings, the second is borrowing, the third is exports, the fourth is imports. Remember, NX is equal to X minus M. So now we enter a recession. So let's start off with NX. Then the question is, if Australia enters a recession, and it's only a recession in Australia, all other countries are fine, will exports change? The answer is going to be no. Foreigners are still going to buy the same quantity of our exports because they're not in recession. Our ability to produce goods and services won't change. So if there's demand there for those exports, then those exports will be produced. So X wouldn't change. Would imports change if we went into a recession? Would you go on, or would typical Australians go on fewer foreign holidays, buy fewer foreign goods and services? Most probably. So M would probably go down. If M goes down, imports go down because Australia's in a recession, the NX line would shift to the right. Now that is true, but I haven't drawn that in. Why? Because I'm not saying it's not important, and I'm not saying you shouldn't draw the NX curve shifting to the right if we go into a recession. But this is the first time we've used this model, and I want to keep it really, really simple. So yes, imports would fall. That would increase the value of X minus M, shift the NX curve to the right. But the bigger effect is going to be an increase in savings as we go into a recession. Well, that's obvious. People would be fearful of losing their job, for example. If they're running a business, they would be fearful of a drop in revenue and profits during a recession. So people will immediately start to save more. It happens during every recession. It's just human nature. And what would happen to borrowing during a recession? Well, borrowing by households, by companies, that's going to fall as well. Happens every time. And it should make intuitive sense to you. You go into a recession, people are spending less. Why would you then go out and borrow more as an individual or a company? It's just too risky. So you save more, you borrow less. Both of those things move the S minus I line to the right. So SI is going to be, well, S2 is going to be greater than S1, and I2 is going to be smaller than I1, indicating that savings have gone up, borrowing has gone down. That means that the savings investment gap in Australia increases to $100 billion. So now what happens is we have not $60 billion worth of excess savings, we have $100 billion worth of excess savings. So that means now that the recession has hit, we're actually sending more investment money, more excess savings, same thing, overseas than before. So there's an even a greater supply of the Australian dollar in the foreign exchange market. We're now pushing $100 billion in terms of the supply of the Australian dollar. We're pushing $100 billion through the Forex market rather than 60. Obviously, that is going to cause a depreciation if you supply more Australian dollars in the Forex market. So the exchange rate depreciates down to ER2 and we move from A to B. Now, as the exchange rate falls, exports are going to increase and imports are going to go down. That's why when we move from A to B, there's also an increase in the level of net exports. So hopefully that makes sense. So what we've got here at a higher level is a recession. We've got, let's say, a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. But as that happens and we save more and borrow less, this vertical line shifts to the right, the exchange rate drops, and we get a boost in net exports. And that boost in net exports helps move the aggregate demand curve a little way back to the right. Now, as we go from A to B, because of a depreciation of the Australian dollar, now remember, when I say NX increases, that is a movement along the NX, the existing NX curve. It's not a rightward shift in the NX curve. The reason we don't shift the NX curve is that the cause of the increase in net exports is a drop in the exchange rate, which is the variable on the vertical axis. When you drop the value of the variable on the vertical axis in a demand supply framework, you move along the curve, you don't shift the curve. So from A to B, NX is still going up. It's just that we're moving along the curve, which indicates that the increase in NX was due to a drop in the exchange rate. Now, as NX goes up, what's going to happen is X goes up and M goes down. When exports go up, that is more aggregate demand for Australian goods and services, but by foreigners. But we've also, in this movement from A to B, we've got imports going down because the exchange rate's dropped. So what you're likely to do in response to this big drop in the exchange rate is cancel your holiday to wherever you're going in the world, because all of a sudden it becomes more expensive. Presumably you haven't booked and paid for things. So you cancel those plans to go overseas and you holiday in Australia instead because of the drop in the exchange rate. So what's happened there is imports have gone down, but as you import fewer foreign holidays during this recession, because the exchange rate's lower, you're actually boosting your consumption spending on Australian tourism services. So a decrease in imports generally leads to an increase in C, consumption spending. It could also lead to an increase in I. So if the drop in the exchange rate in this diagram means that some Australian companies import fewer investment type goods, they may actually find locally supplied domestic alternative investment goods and spend their money on that as well. So you may get a little bit of an increase in investment spending as a result of a drop in imports. Okay, so that's the way it works. Big picture, what is the big picture message here? Well, if we go into a recession in Australia, both savings and borrowing goes down. That lowers the exchange rate, which then increases the value of net exports. And that increase in the value of net exports moves the aggregate demand curve back to the right. And it helps cushion the blow of the recession. So in the recession, there's going to be a drop in C and I typically, which will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left in Australia. But this sort of an effect increases net exports, which then shifts the aggregate demand curve back to the right. Okay, so that is how you use the model. What I'm going to do is record a separate video which will explain to you why Australia has run a current account deficit since the mid-1970s. And then we'll get into some interesting case studies.